Hello, and welcome to this training module on overcoming barriers to connection for people with between people with schizophrenia and their caregivers. My name is Sarah Fernandez. I am a fourth year clinical psychology doctoral student at the University of Denver in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology, and I'm really happy to be sharing this information with you all today. As you can see on this introductory slide, you can see the names of my wonderful doctoral paper chairs and committee. This training module is a part of my doctoral paper project. It's the second part. The first part was a literature review on this topic. The information contained therein is summarized in this training module, and I hope that you find it informative and helpful. You can also find my contact information on this slide should anybody watching want to reach me for any questions, comments, concerns related to this training module. And before I dive in, I just wanted to make a brief note about the incredible artwork that you'll see throughout this presentation. I came across this artist, Brian Charnley, while conducting my research for this project, and really found his work to be quite powerful. He was a prolific and, in my opinion, quite talented artist with schizophrenia who very tragically took his life in the 90s. And I thought it would be poignant to include his work in this presentation. As you can imagine, though, given the little information about him that I just shared, it seems that he suffered quite a lot, and some of the artwork that he created is quite dark. So I just wanted to give a brief content warning there. But again, I also think it's quite beautiful and powerful in the context of this module. So I chose to include it. Why did I choose to create this training tool? For a couple of reasons. I feel quite passionately about this topic, having worked a lot with people with schizophrenia in as a doctoral student and somewhat before beginning this doctoral program. I've worked with people with schizophrenia in both inpatient and outpatient settings, and therefore I've also had the privilege and the honor of working somewhat with their caregivers. And I feel quite passionately about helping improve their quality of life for both patients and caregivers, and helping them connect, which is the purpose of this project. This project is intended to help clinicians who work with these populations, namely people with schizophrenia and their caregivers, better connect with one another. And why did I choose to do a project for that reason? First of all, because the research shows that loneliness it is often unaddressed or underaddressed by clinicians working with these populations. And that's despite the fact that people with schizophrenia see loneliness as quote unquote the top priority facing them in the next year. Also, because you will hear me talk until I'm blue in the face as throughout this module about positive feedback loops. And what feels very clear to me after doing a lot of research on this topic is that connection is vital to the healing and stabilization of both patients and caregivers, and their that in fact their ability to connect and the improvements in quality of life that they may experience as a result are felt by both parties. Um, and as I said, you will hear me talking about feedback loops a lot in this presentation. And that is a really critical feedback loop. That is, quality of life for one increases, so it does for the other. And thus, if clinicians can help form those connections and reduce loneliness, we may see some improvements in the quality of life of all parties. And finally, because I believe there's a gap in both research and practice when it comes to this topic. There's no evidence-based best practice treatment yet for addressing loneliness found among people who experience psychosis. And so this project attempts to help fill this gap a little bit. It certainly is not and should not be taken as establishing an evidence-based best practice by any means, but rather what this project does is provide some psychoeducation on the reasons why connection is challenging for these populations. And compiles some ideas from numerous sources, from literature, academic literature, to specific therapies, to nonprofit organizations that work with these populations to help address loneliness, foster connection between patients and caregivers. And I have compiled many of those ideas in this project. This training module is primarily intended for clinicians working with both people with schizophrenia and their caregivers, or either people with schizophrenia and their caregivers. That having been said, I chose to make it publicly available so that other people could also access it and hopefully get some benefit from it. I make quite a concerted effort throughout this presentation, this module, to make it accessible to family members and caregivers, as well as people with schizophrenia and clinicians, and to make it digestible to a wide audience. Let's define some terms before we dive into the content. I am going to use the term caregiver throughout this presentation to refer to anybody who cares on a day-to-day basis for a person with schizophrenia. That could be a family member, it could be a parent, sibling, a spouse, a friend, but that is going to be how I use the term caregiver. I'm going to use the term patient to refer to a person with schizophrenia in this context. And I do that having thought about it a bit, quite a bit. And the reason for that is that I understand that the word patient has a pathologizing connotation. I think that is true. Nevertheless, I chose to use it for a few reasons. One is that person with schizophrenia is a little bit of a mouthful. So for efficiency's sake, sometimes I will say patient. Also, because much of the research that takes place on this population related to people with schizophrenia takes place in the inpatient context. And in the inpatient context, as opposed to the outpatient context, we use the word patient rather than client. So I thought that that was appropriate as it mirrors the language in the research. And finally, I chose to use the word patient to differentiate when I'm referring to people with schizophrenia from the word client, which I will use in this presentation to refer to either a person with schizophrenia or their caregiver in the context of a clinician's therapeutic work with either one. Here we have the module contents, what you can expect from this training module. I will begin in part one by talking about barriers to connection that exist on the part of patients. And I'm going to start that discussion by talking about internal, biologically based barriers stemming from the patient themselves. I'm then going to talk about barriers that stem from positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia that stem from the illness itself. And finally, barriers that we see occurring within the patient when they interact with their external environment, stemming from caregivers at times, but also sociocultural context. In part two, I'm going to talk about barriers to connection that exist on the part of caregivers. I'm going to spend some time helping us get to know caregivers. Who are they, their demographic characteristics, as well as the idea of caregiver burden, which is both a description of lived experience and a term of art in this subfield, as well as expressed emotion. I'm going to define both of these terms in families where somebody has schizophrenia. And finally, families or households where somebody has schizophrenia. Finally, in part two, I'm going to talk about familial cohesion and protective factors and coping strategies that enable some families to stick together through the disease of schizophrenia, to cope, and to overcome some of these barriers to connection. And finally, in part three, I am compiling, as I mentioned before, ideas and recommendations for promoting cohesion within families and connection between patients and caregivers. And those ideas, as I said before, come from a myriad of sources, from academic journals and particular types of therapies to supportive materials created by nonprofit organizations aimed at helping these populations. So I really worked to cover the range of ideas that I could find through my research, and distill them digestibly in part 3 to provide clinicians with some ideas for how to foster that connection and viewers. Let's dive in. So, beginning in part 1, barriers to connection on the part of the patient, I want to make sure we're starting on the same page. So, the research indicates quite consistently that people with schizophrenia struggle with social skills more than people in the general population. And that's even when they're medically stable and not experiencing psychosis. And what we see from the literature is that social skill deficits are relatively stable throughout the course of the illness and can also have compounding effects over a person's lifetime because of the patient's interactions with the world around them. So, to give a couple examples about what I mean when I say social skill deficits. Social skill deficits can be verbal or nonverbal. The literature indicates that people with schizophrenia struggle somewhat with clarity of speech, verbal, as well as negotiation and persistence, and nonverbal aspects of communication and social skills. That can mean things like demonstrating interest in a topic, fluency of speech, affect, and affect matching, those kinds of things. To give another example, the literature suggests that people with schizophrenia can be less assertive when challenged at times, or too assertive. So, for example, I found one study that suggested that when criticized, controls, so people without schizophrenia in this research study, tended to apologize or try to explain their point of view. And on the other hand, patients in that study had more of a tendency to deny or try to lie when challenged or criticized. So those are some examples of social skill deficits and how they manifest in practice. And then what do I mean when I say that social skill deficits compound over a lifetime, or build on themselves over a lifetime? Schizophrenia, so to give one example, schizophrenia tends to have onset during late adolescence or early adulthood. Um, and what that means, because that period of one's life is such a critical one for building community, for forming relationships of all kinds, is that when somebody has onset in late adolescence or early adulthood, they may struggle to form that community during that critical period, and then don't have that community moving forward throughout their lives. Though, of course, they can make other community, but they aren't able to during that time. And then, in addition, with regard to the compounding effects, we do see a connection, which I'll talk about a lot throughout this presentation, between imposed solitude, so solitude that somebody doesn't choose, solitude that is forced upon them due to social stigma or other factors, and paranoia. So I say that to give this example of how social skill deficits can compound. If somebody in late adolescence or early adulthood struggles to make community and then experiences more solitude, they may have worsened symptoms, which then makes it more difficult to build community, etc. And finally, I wanted to make a note on this introductory slide about the fact that the literature on this topic does not differentiate very much between patients who are medicated and medically stable and those who are not when it comes to social cognition. And that may surprise some folks. It surprised me initially. And there's two main reasons for that lack of differentiation. First, there are, as one can imagine, big ethical problems involved in studying for research people who have untreated schizophrenia and are experiencing active psychosis in terms of consent. So the research ethically um, is generally on people who are medically stable. That being said, what we also see in the literature is that while some antisocial behaviors, so behaviors that are problematic socially, are more common during periods of active psychosis, as we can imagine, due to the presence and intensity of symptoms, of positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. Some social cognitive deficits seem to be relatively stable across the illness, across the lifetime of the patient and the illness. And that's even during periods of symptom remission. And that may surprise some folks, but I'm going to talk about more why that is when I discuss positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia and how they affect social skills. So to continue into part one, I'm going to first talk about internal biologically based barriers to social cognition among people with schizophrenia. But first, let's make sure we're on the same page about what social cognition is. The term social cognition refers to processes that are involved in the perception, encoding, storage, retrieval, and regulation of information about other people and ourselves. These processes include social cue perception, experience sharing, inferring other people's thoughts and emotions, which I refer to below as mentalizing or theory of mind, and managing emotional reactions to others. That's a quote from Green et al. 2015, page 620. So the four components of social cognition are, in short, perception of social cues, the ability to read people, experience sharing, learning through observation, mentalizing or theory of mind, and that one is really important. So it has little asterisks around it, aka putting oneself in another person's shoes. And finally, experiencing and regulating emotion. So our subjective feelings, the feelings that we ourselves experience, and ability to self-regulate. And I'm going to talk about each one individually, but something that I would like to just note before I do that is that what we see from the literature is that most of these components of social cognition are affected to some degree and varying degrees in people with schizophrenia. Perception of social cues, reading people. What we see from the research is that people with schizophrenia struggle to identify others based on characteristics of their facial features, and even more so to correctly identify emotions based on facial expressions. So they may have more difficulty reading people, in a nutshell. They struggle with perception of specific aspects of speech, the literature tells us, like pitch and rhythm can be impacted, which affects how they perceive social cues. So, for example, we as human beings sometimes talk faster when we're nervous. To give an example, somebody with schizophrenia may struggle to understand that somebody talking faster is talking faster because they are nervous, given that that is an aspect of rhythm, and therefore to read them correctly. These challenges with perception of social cues, with reading people, are associated with neurological changes. And that can include things like decreased amygdala activation in response to emotional stimuli and increased activity in other unrelated, as far as we know. Much of this is very mysterious still, but other unrelated, as parts as we know, parts of the brain. So people with schizophrenia may experience neurological changes, meaning that their brains don't light up, don't have activity in the areas that we would expect when perceiving social cues. Experience sharing, learning through observation. This component of social cognition is the most mysterious one when it comes to folks with schizophrenia. We don't really understand to what extent or if it is impacted in them, in that population. And those impacts are relatively unclear, and it may play no role at all. So I'm going to largely skip it, but I included it because it is a component of social cognition. Mentalizing or theory of mind, the ability to put oneself in another person's shoes. This is the area that the literature tells us has the most pronounced deficits among people with schizophrenia. We see consistent abnormalities and difficulties for them in doing mentalization tasks, but we don't entirely understand why. What we do understand from the research is that people with schizophrenia may have difficulty understanding the intentions of others, and that's from both visual and written stimuli and stories. Some studies found that they had decreased activity in some core regions of the brain that are associated with mentalizing or theory of mind. And other studies found that they had hyperactivity, increased activity in those core regions of the brain, or delayed activity of those regions of the brain. And that tendency in particular, the tendency to hypermentalize, has been linked to paranoid symptoms of schizophrenia. But what I would like for you to take away and bear in mind is that mentalizing or theory of mind is a critical component of connection because it is a prerequisite to empathy. If we can't put ourselves in another person's shoes effectively, then we can't empathize with them, at least cognitively. And so mentalization ability is a huge component of forming and maintaining connection and barrier to connection when folks are unable to do it. And finally, experiencing and regulating emotion. So people with schizophrenia experience the same amount of emotion or more than do people without, but they may demonstrate a flatter affect. So they may not be able to demonstrate their emotion as effectively as folks without schizophrenia. However, they struggle a lot with emotion regulation. And that's for a couple of reasons. They have some difficulty challenging or changing, the research tells us, their interpretations of stimuli before responding compared to people without schizophrenia. And that ability to challenge or reinterpret perceptions of stimuli is referred to as cognitive reappraisal. So, in other words, people with schizophrenia struggle more with cognitive reappraisal. What does that mean in practice? To give an example, I think most of us can identify with a moment in life where perhaps we thought that somebody was talking about us behind our back or something. And we may be able to challenge that perception or interpretation of stimuli. People with schizophrenia struggle more to do that. What we also see from the literature is that, and neural imaging studies, is that when people with schizophrenia do cognitive reappraisal, when they try to challenge or change their interpretations of stimuli, they experience less relief from strong emotions and then respond less neutrally than do controls. So, in short, what we see is that it is harder for folks with schizophrenia to regulate their emotions, and they get less relief when they do. So in the previous slide, I was focusing on barriers to connection. Oh, sorry. Yes, barriers to connection that stem from internal, biological, neurological changes and differences among people with schizophrenia themselves. In this slide, I'm going to talk about barriers to connection that stem from the disease of schizophrenia itself and the positive and negative symptoms that are associated with the disease. And I will just make a note that I am trying to separate out these threads of barriers and where they come from for clarity's sake, but they are, of course, all very deeply interconnected. First, let's define some terms. Positive symptoms refer to those that add to a person's psychology. So put something there that wasn't there before. Generally, in schizophrenia, that means delusions, hallucinations, etc. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, refer to those that detract from a person's psychology, that take something away that used to be there. And in the context of schizophrenia, that often looks like those symptoms can include a flat affect, poverty of speech, so losing the ability to speak, etc. And the disease of schizophrenia is characterized by both positive and negative symptoms. That being said, the presentation of those symptoms and the frequency, the complexity of those symptoms varies a lot from person to person for reasons that we don't fully understand. So some people with schizophrenia may have many more positive symptoms than negative ones, or vice versa. Those symptoms some people with schizophrenia could be very responsive to medication when it comes to their positive symptoms, while others may not. So for the presentation, the way that those symptoms look in practice varies quite a bit. What we see from the literature when it comes to social skills is that negative symptoms, those that detract from a person's psychology, affect social skills much more than positive ones. And that may surprise some folks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. Positive symptoms have many effects that we see from the literature. Positive symptoms are related to theory of mind deficits. We see more overinterpretive errors for positive symptoms because of positive symptoms. So that might mean things like seeing malice in neutral stimuli, overinterpreting what somebody experiences or sees. We see more attribution biases and hostility biases related to negative symptoms. And so, unsurprisingly, positive symptoms, hallucinations and delusions primarily, therefore, seem to be related to things like suspicion, paranoia, hypervigilance, and make it difficult to interpret facial expressions correctly. We can imagine, for example, that if somebody is hearing voices telling them that another person is unsafe, they may be more likely to experience them not making eye contact, for example, as a sign of malice. I'm making up that example, but to illustrate the point. And so the effect of positive symptoms is oftentimes, according to the literature, um, unusual behaviors that make others view the patient, unfortunately, as strange and create a feedback loop. So, in other words, with more positive symptoms comes more perceived strangeness. With more perceived strangeness comes more paranoia, hypervigilance, etc., worsened symptomology, etc. And then negative symptoms. So negative symptoms are also related to theory of mind deficits. It's theorized that they may come from the same neurological source. And as I said before, theory of mind is a critical component of cognitive empathy. So if we can't understand and adapt to if we can't read, adapt, and incorporate the behavior and subjective experience of those around us, we have trouble putting ourselves in their shoes, and understanding their thoughts, emotions, etc. People with schizophrenia struggle more because of negative symptoms to match the affects of other people. So, for example, if somebody smiles at them, they may struggle more to smile back. Um, and that's partly because they do struggle to predict or to understand the thoughts and intentions of others. What we see is that negative symptoms have a greater effect on social stigma and perceived strangeness, though, by others. And the reasons for that are somewhat mysterious, but we do see some theories from the literature. So, for example, one theory is that positive symptoms are so easily identifiable as part of a mental illness and are perceived as outside of somebody's control. So they're more likely to engender empathy on an observer. On the other hand, negative symptoms might be perceived as rude or strange in a way that's believed to be within somebody's control. Also, more negative symptoms the literature shows us, can also have a negative impact on self-esteem and the ability to communicate, which are very reinforcing. And so with that decrease in self-esteem and ability to communicate may come less exposure to social situations, less practice for social skills, and more negative symptoms and worsened social skills. Negative symptoms are also less treatable with medication. Antipsychotic medications that can help stabilize somebody with schizophrenia tend to target positive symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, not negative ones. So they don't have very much effect, for example, on if somebody has lost the ability, has some poverty of speech, has lost the ability to speak. medications generally won't be as effective, the research indicates, at bringing back that ability, unfortunately. And here we see a feedback loop because as people interact less with others and are more isolated, they receive less positive reinforcement. They may then have lower self-esteem, and that may increase negative symptoms. So those are some ways in which the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia can relate to social cognition and social skill deficits and connection. And finally, for part one, I want to talk a bit about barriers to connection within the patient that stem from their interactions with the external environment. And I've touched on some of these before in the previous slides, but just to make the point a little bit more clear. Caregivers experience something that is referred to as caregiver burden, strain related to their role that I'll talk a lot more about in part two, and intrafamilial conflict that exists within families, and expressed emotion, which is outward criticism, outward fighting, things that negative expressions of emotion that take place within households. And what we see is that with increased caregiver burden, with increased conflict at homes and expressed emotion, often comes worsened disease progression for patients. I'm going to look at each one in turn, but I'm also going to talk about social stigma and how it interacts with the patient, and solitude. But before I dive into this final this final segment of part one in more depth, I do want to make a note on empathy for caregivers. In my opinion, the literature seems to be unintentionally, I imagine, a little bit judgmental of caregivers. It seems to suggest that caregivers are at fault, perhaps, for failing to remain calm in their role at all times. And what I just want to say about that, particularly for clinicians watching this, is that I think what we are asking of caregivers in this context is a bit unnatural. We're asking for them to have neutral responses to behaviors on the part of the patient, life experiences, experiences with society that would make most people dysregulate. And yet we are asking them to stay regulated. So I really encourage empathy for caregivers as much as possible. So that first bullet, caregiver burden, intrafamilial conflict, and expressed emotion. It's common and understandable for caregivers to experience strain from their role, as I mentioned, known as caregiver burden. And what we see is that with a higher sense of burden, oftentimes comes more conflict within households, unsurprisingly. And that high levels of conflict or relational disturbances, known as expressed emotion, is associated both with greater caregiver burden itself and worse disease progression within patients. So, in other words, with less emotional stability at home, more outward criticism, more fighting, etc., we see things like higher relapse rates, worsened functional outcomes, more medication non-compliance, substance abuse, etc. So here is a really critical feedback loop that I'm going to refer to a lot. With things like relapse due to medication discontinuation, repeated psychotic episodes, rehospitalization, etc., comes poor social skills and cognitive abilities over time in the patient. That can make the caregiving role much more difficult, leading to higher levels of caregiver burden, higher expressed emotion, worsened functional outcomes, and on we go in a bit of a vicious cycle. And again, the point is not to blame caregivers for their emotionality and the effect on patients. The goal is just to understand these dynamics and to try to help them overcome them to whatever degree possible and connect. And still, it is really important to understand the effect of expressed emotion in worsening disease progression and creating a positive feedback loop within the patient. I want to just make a brief note about what I mean when I say positive feedback loop. Positive does not mean good. Rather, what it means is that as one variable, one thing increases, so does another one. In this case, with more expressed emotion comes more caregiver burden, worsened disease outcomes. We see two increased variables. That's as compared to, contrasted to, and I'm sorry, to clarify, that can also go the other way. So it just means two variables moving in the same direction, either up or down. The good thing about this feedback loop is that what we also see is that with less caregiver burden, we also see less expressed emotion and improved symptomology within patients and functional outcomes. So it just means variables that are changing in the same direction, either up or down. And that's compared to a negative feedback loop where one thing increases, another thing decreases. So to give an example, it may be that as income levels for a household increase, caregiver burden decreases. I'm making that up, but that would be an example of a negative feedback loop. And there's some research to suggest that that is true that I'll get into in part two. Social stigma. Social stigma is a really common experience for both patients and caregivers and exists to varying degrees worldwide. What we see very regrettably is that unafflicted people in the general population, people without schizophrenia, often view those with schizophrenia as strange and may marginalize them in society. And caregivers also experience stigma and ostracization because of their role, just because they have a loved one with schizophrenia. And so caregivers are often themselves more isolated because of their role and have less access to community. What we see from the literature is that social stigma is associated with higher levels of caregiver burden and expressed emotion within families. And it's associated with increased negative symptoms, as I mentioned before, which in turn are associated with greater perceived strangeness and difficulty forming connection for patients. And so here we see another set of feedback loops within the patient as they interact with their outside world, that with more social stigma may come more negative symptomology, which in turn is heightens their barriers to connection. I did want to make a note on solitude. The literature, particularly this 2017 article by Seaman, makes a really important distinction between elected or chosen solitude and imposed or forced solitude. Elected solitude, she argues, is really necessary for patients to cope with their symptoms and self-regulate. People with schizophrenia are constantly dealing with so much internal stimuli. They can be voices, etc. And oftentimes being alone is a necessary part of coping with that and is not associated with poor disease outcomes when they choose it. However, imposed solitude due to social stigma, marginalization, etc., is a problem and is associated with more hospitalizations and worsened psychosis. So also with regard to imposed solitude or elected solitude, we see changes, increasing or decreasing barriers to connection among people with schizophrenia. We are back at our module contents, our syllabus, and I'm going to start talking now about part two, barriers to connection on the part of caregivers. I'm going to start by talking a bit about their demographic characteristics, and then I'm going to talk about caregiver burden, expressed emotion in a bit more detail, and familial cohesion and protective factors. First, let's get to know caregivers a little bit. Who are they? What are their experiences like? And why is it important to understand the experiences of caregivers? That question may seem a little bit silly, but I think it's worth spelling out that in order to help facilitate connection between caregivers and patients, clinicians have to really deeply understand the experiences of caregivers, and even more so of caregivers generally, and even more so of their specific clients. Um, and furthermore, because the experiences of caregivers have a profound effect on disease progression among clients, among patients. And so, if we can understand the factors that help caregivers cope with the disease or that make it more difficult for caregivers to cope with the disease, we can we can work to improve those circumstances and facilitate connection more readily. And finally, because the literature indicates that 50 to 70% of people with schizophrenia live with their family members, and that those that live with family members are that it is a strength when people with schizophrenia live with their family members. And so when we talk about working with caregivers, we're not talking about also affecting the lives of a small proportion of people with schizophrenia. We're talking about affecting the lives of most people with schizophrenia. So that makes it all the more important. Some characteristics of caregivers. The literature indicate that caregivers are between are mostly women, 60 to 100%, depending on where we're looking in the world. And that on average, people caretake for roughly 13 years, 67 hours per week. So it is more than a full-time job and one that lasts many years. Caregivers are roughly 30% mothers of patients, around 26% are spouses, 41% are primary school graduates, 60% roughly are married, 62% roughly are unemployed, 61% have middle incomes, and 65% have no help with their caregiving duties. And that's from a study from Nergiz and Gunaydin in 2022. But what we see in the literature in terms of themes that characterize caregivers are low levels of education, not being able to work as caregiving is often a full-time job. So caregivers are often depending upon spouses or other sources of income to sustain their livelihoods, and low levels of support in their role. And then finally, the literature indicates that there are some possible similarities in terms of social and neurocognitive deficits between caregivers, between people with schizophrenia and their first degree relatives who may be caregivers. So the research shows that, in other words, if a person with schizophrenia is cared for by a first degree relative, we may see some similar difficulties with social skills between those two individuals, the patient and the caregiver, despite the fact that the caregiver isn't diagnosed with schizophrenia. Caregiver burden. This is a term that does not only apply in the context of caregiving for a person with schizophrenia. People may experience caregiver burden from their role in caring for somebody with a different serious or persistent mental illness like or SPMI, or conditions like dementia. That being said, the research suggests that people who caregive for someone with schizophrenia specifically tend to report higher levels of burden. And that is for many reasons. And I'm going to spend some time talking about why caregivers may find their role burdensome. To name a few of those reasons, caregivers cite irritability and anger and conflict with patients as a reason for that sense of burden, as well as, unfortunately, some physical aggression on the part of patients and nuisances. Caregiving, as I discussed in the previous slide, also takes a lot of time, and caregivers often have less time for social and recreational interests and activities. They're less able to do self-care, and that contributes to caregiver burden. Substance abuse is also pretty common among people with schizophrenia for reasons that are outside of the scope of this module. But as one can imagine, substance abuse can make caregiving more difficult and feel more burdensome. Caregivers, and this is a bit of a chicken or an egg, but caregivers also experience worsened mental health, like depression, PTSD, hopelessness, anxiety, etc. And so their bandwidth may be somewhat decreased. And because their bandwidth is somewhat decreased by their own mental health concerns, they may feel more burdened by their caregiving role. As I've discussed previously, caregivers often feel socially isolated. They are subjected to social stigma, and they sometimes self-impose isolation, unfortunately, due to shame. Some caregivers may believe that somehow they are at fault or to blame for their loved one having schizophrenia, and they may therefore self-isolate. And we also know that when people are depressed, for example, they're more likely to self-isolate. So there's a bit of a feedback loop there. Caregivers report caregiver burden because of financial stress, because of social stigma itself, and because of self-stigma, which I've alluded to before, which can lead to low self-esteem and more self-isolation. So those are some examples of reasons why reasons the caregivers cite for their experience of burden. So there are some common themes, and there are some common themes overarching those examples. So to quote Lauber et al. In 2003, in their 2003 paper on page 288, perceived caregiver burden ultimately depends on, quote, variables that characterize the contact with the affected, its nature, for example, atmosphere, i.e., disturbing behavior or threats or nuisances, intensity, hours spent with the affected, and the respective consequences, disturbed relationship leading to less confidence between relative and affected, less social activities of relatives. And I added the emphasis, the bolding on a few of those words. But those are themes that impact the amount of caregiver burden that somebody may feel. Next, I want to talk a bit more about expressed emotion, which is a very important concept to understand in the context of this module. Expressed emotion is a measure of both how critical, hostile, and over-involved a caregiver is toward the patient, quote unquote, and how warm they are. So expressed emotion doesn't necessarily need to be that critical, hostile, or over-involved version. It can be just a description of lots of emotion, which can certainly be lots of expressed emotion, which can be warm. But for reasons that I think are fairly self-explanatory, in the context of this module, I am referring to expressed emotion primarily as the first version because of how that critical, hostile, over-involved version contributes to worsened functional outcomes for patients and disconnection between patients and caregivers. What I really would love for anyone watching this to take away is that heightened expressed emotion, more criticism, hostility, over-involvement, fighting, insulting, etc., within households is the single greatest predictor of relapse among patients. And it is therefore a vital part of this positive feedback loop. So with worsened patient behavior or with difficult patient behavior, we see more caregiver burden and more expressed emotion. We then see worsened disease outcomes, more rehospitalization, poor medication compliance, more substance abuse, etc. And with those worsened disease outcomes comes worsened patient behavior. And so we are in this vicious cycle, this feedback loop. There are many factors that affect expressed emotion among caregivers and that sort of help determine or explain how much expressed emotion is occurring within households. Caregivers, the research indicates, are more likely to insult or criticize, excuse me. Caregivers are more likely to insult or criticize the patient because of negative symptoms than positive ones, the research indicates. And that might be, as I mentioned before, because positive symptoms are so obviously a result of the illness of schizophrenia and are perceived as outside, are more likely to be perceived as outside the patient's control, while negative symptoms may be perceived as more within their control and therefore as rude. By caregivers. So caregivers are more likely to insult, which is a type of expressed emotion, or criticize because of negative symptoms than positive ones. Cultural differences are a big factor in how much expressed emotion exists within households. In some cultures, high levels of criticism is believed to be a caring, loving form of parenting. In others, the opposite is true. High levels of criticism is considered a less caring form of parenting. So cultural differences can have an impact on the amount of expressed emotion we see within households. Patient behavior, understandably, is a big factor in determining the level of expressed emotion within homes. Unfortunately, the research does indicate that more than half of relatives feel that they deal with irritability, or report that they deal with irritability, anger, and serious conflicts with the patient. And more than 1/3 of caregivers report that the patient is physically violent towards them at times, or has been in the past. Self-blame for the patient's illness can increase expressed emotion within homes. Also, things like having a negative attribution style, having less insight, a tendency towards pessimism or dissatisfaction, and a lower sense of self-efficacy can all make a caregiver more likely to criticize, to be hostile, to lash out, and to feel burdened by their role. Furthermore, empathetic caregivers have more of a tendency to overstretch themselves with loving intentions, but difficult and troublesome results, because that excessive self-sacrifice is often associated with worse outcomes for both caregivers and patients, because their bandwidth may be decreasing and their sense of caregiver burden may increase. Unsurprisingly, exhaustion and stress can lead to more expressed emotion, and a lack of social support, a lack of quality time with friends and family, and loss of their social lives that they had prior to onset is associated with more expressed emotion. And the good news is that the same is also true in reverse. So when we see that caregivers are able to take care of their own needs, that they are able to maintain social connection, to do self-care, we see less expressed emotion within homes. And I also wanted to make a note about this because it my concern is that it makes it sound like caregivers who are overstretching themselves or who aren't able to take care of their own needs are in some way to blame as well. And I simply don't think that that is the case. I think there are many real life reasons, like financial stress, etc., why some caregivers may be more able to do self-care, to take care of their own needs, while others are not. But what is clear is that if they are able to, if they're able to carve out small ways of taking care of themselves, there is less expressed emotion within homes, according to the literature. And furthermore, I think I would be remiss to not discuss the fact that caregiving is certainly not an entirely negative experience for people. Obviously, the purpose of this project is to help caregivers and patients overcome barriers to connection. So I am focusing more on negative aspects of caregiving because they form the basis of some of those barriers. But there are certainly some positive aspects of caregiving as well, that I want to just touch on briefly. Caregivers report feeling a deeper sense of connection with their loved one due to their caregiving role. They feel a sense of personal growth and pride in the fulfillment of their responsibility. And finally, caregivers are sometimes able to find community among people with similar experiences, and to feel less alone in their experience for that reason. This is the final subsection of part 2. I'm going to talk about some protective factors and coping strategies employed among caregivers and families. And when I say protective factors, what I mean are factors that help protect caregivers from their sense of burden, that help protect against disconnection between patients and caregivers, um, and that help preserve the well-being of all involved. I'm going to consider each of these protective factors and coping strategies one at a time. First, family sense of coherence or family hardiness. These are two concepts that I came across in my research. One, family sense of coherence, as referred to by Nergiz and Gunaydin in 2022, on page 638, and family hardiness as developed by Bishop and Grief in 2015, page 465. And these concepts, in my opinion, just map closely onto one another, so they're worth discussing in tandem. Family sense of coherence refers to a sense of collective resiliency and stress adaptation within families. Family hardiness refers to the internal strengths of the family, as well as the durability of the family unit. And what we see from the literature is that with an increased level of family sense of coherence or family hardiness comes an increased ability to handle, cope, respond to the difficult situations that come up when one has a loved one with schizophrenia or is a caregiver. And that it's also, and this is a quote from Nergiz and Gunaydin, page 638 in 2022. It is also expressed that support sources and coping strategies, family coherence, used in crises encountered are transferred from generation to generation. So, for instance, in families where we have a parent being a caregiver for their child, and then eventually a sibling becoming that caregiver, this family sense of coherence can be passed down. And so it builds capacity across generations. And what we see is that with a greater sense of family coherence or family sense of coherence or family hardiness comes a better ability to adapt to the onset of the illness. And there are many factors that help us understand why some families have more of a sense of coherence or hardiness. Those factors can include things like intimacy, how close the family members feel to one another, codependence. In some cultures, the United States is a very individualistic culture, relatively speaking, but some cultures really embody the idea that it takes a village. And so when we have more codependent values, we often see a greater sense of of coherence or hardiness within families. Having more psychoeducation about schizophrenia increases, this is associated with increases in this family sense of coherence and family hardiness, according to the literature. If people can understand what's going on, it helps them build empathy for themselves and for the patient. And it helps them manage emotions related to their experience of caregiving. A strong sense of we, that we're all in this together, very related to that codependence, although not entirely the case. There can be a strong sense of we without codependent values. The patient's ability to be independent is a factor that helps increase family sense of coherence and hardiness, depending on the culture. And finally, families that find meaning and self-actualization in their roles and circumstances are more likely to have a greater sense of family coherence and family hardiness. And what we see is that with greater family sense of coherence or hardiness comes less of a sense of burden and less expressed emotion within homes. So if we think back to our key positive feedback loop, in other words, with patient behavior comes more caregiver burden. With worsened patient behavior comes more caregiver burden, more expressed emotion, worsened functional outcomes, worsened patient behavior. With more family sense of coherence, we are working against that sense of caregiver burden and expressed emotion. And those ripple effects can be felt throughout that cycle, throughout that system, by the patient and then by the family members in turn. What I will just say is that I want to be wary of making it sound like this family sense of coherence or family hardiness is just kind of plucked out of nowhere by some families and not by others. Family sense of coherence can be very dependent and vary a lot according to the literature by socioeconomic status, the duration of the illness, and availability of community and government resources. The second protective factor that I want to discuss is intrafamilial and social support. This is a quote by Glesia and Lee in 2013, page 10915. Patients who have family members to provide care for them report decreased symptoms and less incidences of relapse, better treatment adherence, and reduced hospitalizations as compared to those who do not. And so what that means is for any caregivers watching this who are caregiving for a family member, is that just having family members to provide care is a huge protective factor and makes a really big difference. And I think that's important to highlight. Support can be, and then also with more intrafamilial and social support, we see comes less expressed emotion within households. And so that support, that social support can be practical. It can be providing money, transportation, food, etc. And it can also be emotional. So for supportive people who can't provide that practical support, just listening, just providing emotional support, just being empathetic, non-judgmental, is very impactful to helping caregivers cope and helping patients cope as well. Whenever possible, the literature shows us that talking about the illness, talking about the experience of caregiving can be very beneficial to reducing caregiver burden and expressed emotion within homes. And what we see is that social connection mitigates caregiver burden even when factors like poverty are present. So in other words, even when caregivers may be really struggling due to factors like poverty, having some social connection can still reduce their caregiver burden. And finally, having interdependent values are a protective factor because having intrafamilial and social support is so impactful. In other words, that interdependent values are themselves a protective factor because they make it more likely when a culture is more interdependent to mean that somebody has social support. or that a family has social support. Another protective factor is warmth and positive affect, which is associated with decreased symptom severity and caregiver burden. And that being said, warmth and positive affect is also very culturally dependent. In some cultures, more warmth and more positive affect is more common, more acceptable, more normalized. In others, it's not. And so the extent to which this is a protective factor varies by culture. But warmth and positive affect can look like very different things. Humor is an example. Humor is a really important defense and barrier to melancholy, to sadness, and to burden. Not barrier, but shield. Um, Sticking up for one another is an example of what warmth and positive affect can look like, especially in the face of other people's ignorance and gossip. We can imagine that that really contributes to that strong sense of we, as well as noted on the slide related to family sense of coherence, honest, affirming communication, and families just having fun together and it not always being about the schizophrenia. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in part 3 because it's really important. Acceptance is a protective factor. Acceptance means, quote, a passive appraisal of their family situation, formulated as accepting the illness and letting the family feel together. That's a quote from Bishop in Grief, 2015, page 468. And so what we see is that with more acceptance comes decreased caregiver burden and expressed emotion. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop. As we have more acceptance, we see less caregiver burden and expressed emotion. That being said, acceptance may look like collusion at times. And that's because acceptance may mean not forcing one's beliefs or opinions on the patient. If they're discussing their own belief system or experiences that they may be having internally, acceptance may look like just letting them have it and not trying to change it or force one's beliefs and opinions on them. Acceptance may also look like stepping back as the caregiver to prevent that over-involvement in the patient's life, and accidentally or inadvertently discouraging self-actualization or independence. And again, that's very culturally dependent, but is worth saying. Hope is a huge protective factor, as one can imagine. Hope requires being grounded in an achievable reality. Its capacity to be achieved distinguishes it from wishful thinking, quote unquote. A quote by Bland and Darlington, 2002, page 61. In other words, hope is about something that can be achieved, is about something that is possible. And that possibility is the difference between hope and wishful thinking. And oftentimes, what I would like for clinicians watching this to take away is that we may often be the hope carriers for a patient or caregiver or a family, and that that is a really impactful and important part of our roles. Hope can look like having a future orientation, even in times of sorrow. And sources of hope can really vary. They can come from many different places. They can come from family and friends, from healthcare workers and mental health workers, from faith and spirituality, etc. What I would like to just note is that sometimes, as knowledge about the duration of the illness of schizophrenia increases, and as psychoeducation about the disease of schizophrenia increases, hope may decrease, but acceptance may increase. And so, unsurprisingly, schizophrenia is a very challenging illness to deal with. It's a lifelong condition, although many patients can become medically stable and experience full or partial symptom remission over the course of the illness. But it is a lifelong illness that is very challenging. And so I just want to note that psychoeducation is a bit double-edged in this way. because as knowledge about the illness increases, especially at first, it can mean that hope decreases, but over time, that acceptance also increases, which is a huge protective factor. Faith and spirituality. As I mentioned earlier, when families, caregivers, and patients are able to make meaning, find purpose in their role, it serves as a big protective factor. That faith, that meaning making, that spirituality is associated with higher levels of self-confidence, of self-care, and of improved mental health among caregivers. It also presents opportunity for community because caregivers and patients can engage in houses of worship and find community through those spaces. And finally, faith and spirituality helps maintain hope, helps maintain the belief that there is a reason for suffering, that their suffering can be alleviated, that there is a higher power out there looking out for folks. And so it is a really big strength when caregivers and families and patients have faith and spirituality on their side. And our final protective factor, coping strategy, is psychoeducation. This is an area where clinicians have a lot to contribute. As I mentioned before, psychoeducation is a little bit double-edged because first of all, it's not enough in and of itself to mitigate caregiver burden and foster connection, but also because psychoeducation can reduce hope. That being said, it also has tremendous benefits. It can help people cope and reduce caregiver burden and relapse if they know what's going on within themselves, both as caregivers and patients. It can help foster empathy for the patient. When psychoeducation is provided to support systems, it can help them better support both caregivers and patients. And psychoeducation is particularly impactful during onset and in the early stages of the illness, which are tremendously confusing and distressing for all involved. So it really does help to understand what's going on, even if that doesn't mean that they're able to fix it or stop it. Psychoeducation can be very destigmatizing, both towards self and towards others. And it can form the basis of a strong therapeutic alliance between clinicians and clients, which in and of itself is really vital coping strategy and can reduce burden, having that strong therapeutic alliance. And now we're on to part 3, ideas and recommendations for promoting cohesion within families and connections between patients and clients. And as I mentioned before, through my research, compiled a number of these ideas from many different sources, ranging from most structured, most formal, and evidence-based therapies and interventions to just ideas for having fun and enjoying family time in ways that are not directly, at least on their face, targeting the schizophrenia or related to the schizophrenia, but nevertheless can have a really meaningful impact on fostering connection between patients and caregivers and families. I'd like viewers to take a few things from this final part of this module. Again, that one, imposed isolation worsens outcomes for both patients and caregivers. Isolation that is not chosen, but forced or imposed, and leads to more expressed emotion within homes. Second, that defeatism and social avoidance, often due to self-stigma or depression, contribute to the downward spiral of more expressed emotion and burden within homes and to that feedback loop. Third, that fun and mutual enjoyment matter a lot. Clinicians should really take this to heart, in the sense that even though it may not on its face seem like a form of treatment, when we can facilitate families, caregivers, and patients just enjoying themselves together genuinely, just having fun, it can really increase their capacities for difficult times, improve mental health, reduce caregiver burden, and help form connection through a myriad of different pathways, really. And finally, that clinicians watching this should really try to provide patients and caregivers with a tailored menu of ideas, which is part of why I'm providing such a wide range of ideas in this final part for improving their connection, so that families can decide for themselves what works best for them in the context of their lives. So first off, starting with the more structured, formal, evidence-based side of this spectrum of ideas are social skills training and occupational therapy, which the research suggests are most impactful, most effective when done together, rather than one or the other alone. Social skills training teaches basic skills in communication and problem solving, things like how to ask for help, how to engage, so how to demonstrate interest in a conversation, how to listen actively. Occupational skills training helps people achieve more independence by relearning activities of daily living that they may have unlearned as a result of the illness. Social skills training and occupational therapy have the effect of targeting and can help with negative symptoms in particular, specifically, especially when practiced regularly and incorporated into recreational activities. And particularly since, as I mentioned before, negative symptoms are not often targeted or improved through medication, that makes this social skills training and occupational therapy all the more meaningful. What I would say is that when it comes to social skills training and occupational therapy, it's really important for that they be paired with real life enjoyable activities. So, for example, in a 2014 study by Ono and Inu, they found that patients' cognitive abilities improved when they engaged in social skills training as well as a cooking class, but not from doing social skills training alone. And the reason that these two types of therapies or trainings, social skills training and occupational therapy, are most impactful when done together, according to the literature, is that patients with schizophrenia report that it's difficult for them to translate the information that they glean or that they get from a social skills training program to the real world. Social skills training programs are often done in a sort of classroom setting, more teaching-based learning. And so it's hard to apply that knowledge to real life situations. And occupational therapy helps bridge that gap because it's helping people relearn activities of daily living. What we see is that generally activity-based groups are better at reducing symptoms and improving outcomes than verbally based groups. And that's especially when they involve reciprocal enjoyment, mutual enjoyment, and interaction by all parties. So, in other words, to give an example, that cooking class might be more beneficial than a friendship training program between people with schizophrenia and volunteers, where it really is about the schizophrenia and for the patient, not for the volunteer. The second idea is neurocognitive training. Um, Neurocognitive training can include things like psychoeducational programs, which reduce caregiver burden and improve patient outcomes in the community and have the effect, the research indicates, of reducing depression among caregivers and strengthening that therapeutic alliance. Um, And neurocognitive training can look like other forms of training as well, but just to give one example. The reason why neurocognitive training is so important or can be so helpful is, quote, that social cognition mediates between neurocognition and functional outcomes. And so what that means is that even when we have some of the neurocognitive changes and deficits that I talked about early on in this module, if folks can improve their social cognition, it can mitigate, mediate, offset some of that difference when it's translated into a functional outcome. The literature indicates that neurocognitive training is also most effective when combined with social skills training, and that neurocognitive training is most effective when done at the family level, like one family at a time, or when caregivers engage in programming alone, in neurocognitive programming alone, like psychoeducational programming. The third category of ideas are group activities. So now we're moving further from the more formalized, which I've just discussed, social skills training, occupational training, and neurocognitive training, over to the less formalized. And now we're moving along that spectrum. Group activities are ones that fill the cups, or are mutually enjoyable for both patients and caregivers, and that also have the added benefit of improving social skills. So in one study by Addery and Park from 2002, for example, they conducted a study to test the effectiveness of a choral singing group, like a choir, on reducing loneliness and barriers to connection and symptom severity for patients, and found it effective in addressing all three. And that's despite the fact that it wasn't a therapy group, it was just a choir. Cooking groups, as I mentioned previously, spirituality-based groups and activities. Those are things like going to houses of worship together, Bible study, prayer groups, etc. And then there were a number of strategies that were listed in a material created by the Voice Collective in 2002, page 12. And I'm just going to go ahead and read some of those ideas for group activities that they listed in that material. Listening to music, playing computer games, going for a walk, playing sports, cleaning, painting, drawing, creative writing, planning something, reading a magazine, thinking games, singing, watching music TV, I think that's like music videos, making something out of clay, newspaper, plasticine, and being around other people or cooking. So all of those group activities, while not explicitly therapeutic, can have a therapeutic effect and can help improve connection. So just to give clinicians, family members, patients, caregivers watching this some ideas of things that might be helpful to engage in as a group. Some other strategies, some other ideas that may be helpful for improving connection, which often involves the ability to self-soothe. So this slide is really focusing on that self-soothing part. Patients and caregivers can create a good memory box together or separately, something that they can look at together or independently during difficult times and remind them of more joyful times as a way of self-soothing. And then patients and caregivers can create a safe haven within their homes where the patient or the caregiver can go when they need to be alone and then when they need to be in a quiet place. And they can come up with norms around that. So for example, when someone is in the safe haven, they don't get interrupted, for example. Or when someone is in the safe haven, we try to reduce loud noise in the rest of their house so that it really can be a quiet place for them. And that safe haven can be any number of places. It can be the corner of a room. It can be a particular corner of a room. It can be a particular room in the house. If folks have some outdoor space, it could be an outdoor space, but really a place where everyone within the home understands that if somebody goes there, they're going there to self-soothe, and that is designed to be comforting, to be calming, and peaceful to them, to enable them to do so. Thirdly, clients can create a symbolic safe place within an object that is reassuring to them. So some examples may be a seashell. They could be a beloved teddy bear, a box, etc. But the idea being that if there isn't physical space within a home to create a physical safe haven, that it's a place that folks can look at and and feel that there is a safe place inside of it that they can build within their minds symbolically. And finally, doing a safe place visualization can be connecting and soothing. And something that I want to make sure I'm saying is that all of these activities can be, all of these self-soothing strategies can be things that are done individually or collectively. So safe place visualization, for instance, is a place fully within someone's mind, which gives it the benefit of being accessible anywhere, anytime, and that nobody can take away. Where they build a safe place in their imaginations. And they can go there alone or they can go there with someone else. So that can be created collectively or individually. I want to pause for just a second before going on to my last set of strategies for uh, ideas for improving connection, to give a reminder about solitude and the fact that though a lot of these activities, I'm emphasizing the way in which they can be done together to promote connection. I just want to remind viewers that alone time, elected solitude is important and should be respected and encouraged by both clinicians and family members and household members, caregivers and patients alike, so that patients and caregivers can take care of themselves when they need to be alone. Finally, strategies, ideas for reducing expressed emotion and improving effective communication within homes. Clinicians can help patients and caregivers learn effective communication strategies, and that can have a tremendous impact on reducing expressed emotion at home. And there are many ways to do that. Mindfulness practices and therapies and mindful self-compassion are one sort of overarching set of strategies. Mindfulness and acceptance-based practices and therapies can help reduce caregiver distress. Mindful self-compassion is also associated with decreased caregiver burden and expressed emotion within families. And mindfulness can also be combined with other strategies and interventions, other therapies, medications, etc., and can help reduce both positive and negative symptoms, according to the literature, and improve self-awareness and overall functioning for patients. So what do I mean by mindfulness? Mindfulness can look like a number of different things. Mindfulness, and maybe more readily accessible or more a part of patients and caregivers' daily lives already, depending on their cultural background. So, for example, many mindfulness strategies come from Buddhist traditions. And so some families with a more Buddhist background may already be employing some of these skills, and it may come more naturally to them. But it can be learned and cultivated by anyone. And so what do I mean by mindfulness skills? It can be many things. It can be mindful breathing or co-breathing. One example of co-breathing can be asking patients and caregivers to sit back to back and feel one another's breaths and try to mirror one another's breaths. Mindful listening is just listening that pays attention to how the listener is feeling and doesn't try to change anything, is not trying to convince anyone of anything. It's just non-judgmental, open, and self-aware. Mindfulness tools can be accessed in a variety of ways. There are many, many free mindfulness videos and guided mindfulness activities on things like YouTube, and mindfulness apps, as well as mindfulness groups that can often be found at community mental health centers or community centers. And mindfulness is also a key part of some formal therapies like CBT and ACT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. Also, effective communication can be learned through acceptance-based practices and therapies. Um, I'm sorry, going back for a second to mindfulness. Families, caregivers, and patients can create calming rituals and mindful rituals within their homes, which can be both individual and group-based. Those can be things like making, this is a quote from the Voice Collective, anything from making a hot drink, playing scales on a musical instrument, practicing Tai Chi or yoga, bouncing a ball, reading a reassuring poem or story, watching a favorite program, holding a favorite toy or blanket, or saying a prayer. Some young people find safety in patterns, in which case puzzles and doodling may be helpful too. It's from the Voice Collective, pamphlet number 2, 2012, page 14. And so, and mindful communication can also reduce expressed emotion and promote connection. So mindful communication is that which is calm, kind, non-judgmental listening by caregivers. This overlaps quite a bit with the idea of acceptance-based listening, and non-judgmentalism. Caregivers can practice acceptance by believing that their loved ones' internal experiences are real to them and not fighting the symptoms in that way, and not trying to force or change the beliefs of the patient. Through that non-judgmentalism, through that acceptance-based listening, we often see a bit of a snowball effect where that really increases trust and intimacy, which can also help de-escalate situations that are really difficult. And if you recall, increase family sense of coherence. And over time, what I will just say is that while acceptance-based listening should, and mindful listening should really be not aiming to force or change the beliefs of the patient, over time, with enough trust and intimacy, caregivers may be able to help their loved ones decode or challenge or manage their voices, and thereby continue to promote safety, intimacy, and connection. And that may help reduce volatility at home. And so we see the way that these effective communication strategies, and skills for reducing expressed emotion also play very much into that positive feedback loop, where when caregivers can use these tools to manage their own experience, it can reduce expressed emotion, improve functional outcomes within patients, reduce caregiver burden, and on we go with a positive feedback loop that is positive. We've come to the end of this module. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it was informative. And I just want to thank briefly my wonderful doc paper committee for all of their for their help and support, and my own friends and family for their help and support throughout my doctorate. And the last thing that I'm going to do is just scroll through my references. And in case anybody would like to check out any of those materials or know more about the literature that informed this module. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of this module. Thank you very much again. One last note is just that the citations for the artwork by Brian Charnley, if anybody would like to check those out in more depth, it can be found underneath the artwork itself on each of the slides of this presentation. Thank you again and take care.